You see?
Hello, we'll get started in just a second. Okay, hello everybody. Glad you could all make it. How was your weekend?
Right.
Hey everybody, glad you could join us. What did you think of Dr. Farous's lecture last time? On Friday.
I thought it was well. I like how interactive she really is, and that's the reason I think it was pretty well.
Good.
I usually enjoy her lectures.
Good. She's going to go ahead and do another one on Wednesday while I'm off at a conference, so that'll work out really well. Really, what I wanted to focus on in this section of the course is the effects of climate change. We've kind of already proved that it's happening, why it's occurring. We understand the basis behind it, what the physics are, and now it's really time to kind of like pour in and look at the different effects. There's so many. It's probably impossible to cover all of them in just one course, right? And I didn't think that the textbook does a really good job of talking about the impacts on biology. And since we're in a biotechnology program, we're probably most interested in the effects on biology, et cetera, that we might be able to mitigate, using things like genetic engineering and biotechnology, for example. So today I kind of want to dive into that a little bit more. We've talked about ocean acidification and how it affects organisms in the food webs in the ocean. We've talked about its effects on weather and how it increases weather effects, makes weather more extreme, either extremely more wet or extremely more dry, depending on where you're looking. And so today I was going to focus a little bit on more biology and talking specifically about evolution and how that works. So let me go ahead and share. Let's see how this goes. There we go. So this really isn't related to a chapter in the book. but I think it's kind of a good stepping stone of where we should go next. So we know that with climate change, things are going to, if things are changing, especially if they're changing drastically, things are going to have to adapt, right? So how does that adaptation occur? Like, how do organisms adapt to these kinds of changes? What's the mechanism for that?
Change on a genetic level.
Change on a genetic level, right? So what we're talking about here is evolution, right? And typically we expect evolution to occur over a long time period. Now, you mentioned it's change on a genetic level. So could you describe or could you define what evolution is on a genetic level? What that means specifically?
Um, change, well, evolution, being the passing, of generations of genetic material, to benefit survival of a particular organismic species. For example, people have evolved to be able to store fat more as opposed to hundreds of thousands of years ago.
Mm-hmm. Now, is evolution always towards the betterment of a species?
No, no.
I mean, because you had said to make it more survivable. So can you give me an example of how it might not be?
Another example, or a negative example, I would say, could be how I believe at one point um, we were more inclined to, well, I have to think about that because that was going to be wrong. I do have to think about that. That was going to be wrong.
Anybody else want to take a stab at a scientific definition of evolution? Desire, Glory, anyone?
Hello, Prof. Hello,
Okay,
Prof.
go ahead. Yeah, Shepard, what you got to say?
I think these are changes in heritable characteristics, let's say, of an organism.
Okay, the characteristics, a change in the characteristics of an organism?
To add on to what he has mentioned, not only heritable, but also evolution can have environmental factors come into play. So wherein organisms like evolve, they change with the changing environment. So they try as much as best to acclimatize to the changing environment so they can better survive.
So that's why they do it, is so they can. So is there a conscious effort behind evolution? Like, I'm trying to make my species better?
Not really conscious, but it is it is innate in biology for a species to thrive to survive.
Right. But then now we're getting away from the scientific part of stuff, right? So it's really important not to anthropomorphize or to give emotions to or really characterize evolution. So I'll throw out a definition. It's the change in distribution of an allele in the genomes of a population over time. Just simply put. So there's no emotion here. There's no favoritism. There's no saying one thing is better than another. There's not even saying anything about trying to better the organism or give it better traits. It simply changes in the distribution of alleles in the genomes of a population. And so, for those of you who aren't familiar, the term allele, that's basically if you've got a gene, you might have different versions of that gene. Like, for example, eye color. If you have brown eyes, you have the brown allele version of eye color. If you have blue eyes, you have two alleles for blue color, and that's why you have blue eyes. And so there can be, you know, same thing with hair color. There are different alleles that help determine hair color. And for every trait an organism has, since all of its traits come from its genes and its genetic diversity, that means you're going to be able to trace back whatever characteristics they have to particular sets of genes. And the genes can change over time, right? Our definition of genome is just the complete set of genes or genetic material that the organism has. And so we're talking about the genomes in a population. And it's just about, so evolution is just about changes in frequency of those different alleles of those genes. Now, you could have a new gene, that's certainly possible. And that would be a change in the diversity or a change in the frequency of that particular allele. And, you know, generally one allele can change to a different through the process of mutation. And there's lots of different ways mutations can occur. We have hundreds of millions, if not billions, of high energy particles coming from space that are raining down on our planet. Now, many of them are filtered out by our ozone layer, right? Because they interact with the O3 molecules and then don't reach the surface. But many do reach the surface, go right through our skin, and they happen to be of the right frequency to break or change some of the bonds in our DNA, which could cause one nucleotide base to be misread as another nucleotide base. And so when the genome gets copied, there's a change in the DNA sequence. Now, most of the time, a single base change may not have any effect. And we have fantastic, especially as humans, we have fantastic mechanisms and machinery that go through and repair mutations. Like if there's a gamma ray that comes in and creates an altered base, we have lots of different mechanisms which will go through and actually repair it and recorrect it to the correct base. But 1 in 10 million times, that doesn't work efficiently, and so you actually accrue a new mutation. But a single point mutation often has very little effect. Usually in most enzymes, and we'll go over this in next semester when we talk about protein structure, function, and dynamics, most proteins only have a few residues which are really actually very important to their function. The rest are just structural to hold the enzyme to be its particular shape. And so often single point mutations don't make much of a difference over time. But they can. And so you can accrue mutations that way. Errors can happen when the DNA is being copied. Sometimes a base is mismatched. Now, again, we have a lot of error correction machinery that corrects that, but sometimes 1 in 100 million chance of it not getting corrected and just getting promulgated through the next species or through the next offspring. You can also have gene duplication events, gene deletion events, or parts of the gene is deleted or inserted. So there's lots of different ways by which we can have mutations, but lots of organisms have lots of machinery to kind of repair it. So this is our definition of what evolution is. So given this definition, let's kind of work through how it works. So there are 3 main steps to evolution, okay, or 3 main parts to it, or principles, if you will. The first one is variation. So the idea is you have some sort of population of organisms, whether it's humans or bacteria or bunnies. You've got a large population, and within that population, there's some amount of variation. You can't get evolution if you don't have variation of traits. If all the traits are the same, you're not really going to get any evolution. Now, how do you get that variation? That comes by those mutations that we talked about. And many of those mutations are going to seem completely benign, and you're not going to tell whether it's good or bad or anything like that. Okay? So variation is defined as just differences in the traits of organisms within a species. And they may or may not have any obvious advantages or disadvantages. That really isn't important. There just has to be differences. Okay. The next step, and this is when those differences start to matter, is when you have a selection, or what we call a selective pressure. And so a selective pressure is a stress on the system that affects one of two things: either survival to the reproductive age or reproductive behavior. Those are the only two things that really matter when it comes to evolution. Okay. Some pressure is going to come in, and it's going to have an effect on either the survival to the reproductive age or to reproductive behavior. And then lastly, as you can kind of guess where this points, the third principle has to do with reproduction, right? That's generating offspring and passing on these traits via the DNA to the offspring. So one example I like to give is, so if you close your eyes for a minute, and I want you to do this thought experiment with me. I want you to close your eyes and imagine a giant field covered with green grass as far as the eye can see. It's a lush field. It's got hills and just perfectly idyllic. And you throw onto this field a bunch of bunnies, bunny rabbits. Okay, and you got all sorts of bunnies running around. You got bunnies with long ears and bunnies with short ears, bunnies with long legs and bunnies with short legs. And you got bunnies with bushy tails, and you got brown ones and white ones, all different sorts of bunnies. Okay, and they're frolicking around on this field, and this can go on and on and on and on. And then at some point, I want you to imagine on this field of bunnies hopping around, somebody throws down some lions and tigers and bears. Oh my. And these lions and tigers and bears, they're hungry, very, very, very hungry. And so they start running to try and catch food. Okay. Now, it doesn't matter whether a bunny has a bushy tail or not a bushy tail. Bear is going to want to eat it either way. So it starts chasing bunnies. The only thing that does seem to make a difference is the size of the legs. You got bunnies with long legs and bunnies with short legs and bunnies with medium legs. Which bunnies do you think are going to get caught first?
The short and the medium legs.
Yeah, the short and the medium leg bunnies, those lions and tigers and bears are going to have a feast. They're going to run around all season long, grabbing up as many of those bunnies as they can catch, and they're going to eat them. Are they going to catch some long-legged bunnies? Sure. But mostly they're going to catch the short-legged bunnies because they're the easiest ones to get. So they eat up all those short-legged bunnies. And then the next season comes around, spring comes around, and bunnies are going to do what bunnies like to do, which is reproduce. And so you're going to have all these bunnies reproducing. But remember, we ate all the short-legged bunnies. Okay? And so they don't get to reproduce. Now, it's possible, like with humans, you can have two tall parents and they can actually have a short child. So it's certainly possible that the medium-legged bunnies and the long-legged bunnies that are still around, maybe there's one or two smart short-legged bunnies. When they reproduce, it's possible to make some more short-legged bunnies. But overall, the statistics of the short-legged bunnies would be much more depressed, right? There'd be fewer of them. So bears come out of hibernation, summertime, they get hungry and they start chasing bunnies. Which ones are they going to catch next?
If the majority are are long-legged, they'll probably catch those next.
Yeah, well, we've got medium-legged still, and maybe
Okay,
a few
well,
short-legged.
medium legs.
So then they're going to finish
Next are
off the
medium.
short-legged bunnies and start eating the medium-legged bunnies. And you can see where this is going. By the end of that season, there's not going to be that many around. And so when reproduction season comes around, when the next spring comes around, there's going to be fewer, if any, short-legged bunnies, way fewer medium-legged bunnies, and just really long-legged bunnies. And so when they reproduce, now what you've seen is a change in the distribution of that allele for leg size over time in that population. And that's what gives you evolution. Okay. So it's got to be something that affects survival to the reproductive age, right? It doesn't matter if one of these guys got, that's why we don't see genes for immortality. If you think about humans, why do we only live as long as we do? Why aren't some people, why don't we select for immortality? It's because there isn't necessarily an advantage to that. All that matters is, do you reproduce? Do you have children? Now, somebody who lives a longer life might be able to have more children. And so there we start seeing increases of lifespan. The other effect could be on reproductive behavior. So there's probably a lot, especially in human evolution, where preferences have actually mattered a lot, have affected whether or not somebody can reproduce. What people find attractive, what they don't find attractive, whatever affects the chances of somebody having offspring is going to be what affects evolution. But it all has to start with having variation in the species, having something that allows you to have differences, and then having a selective pressure. Okay. Does anybody know what happens if you don't have a selective pressure? Do you still have evolution?
I think you still have evolution.
You do.
I don't believe it's as rapid with pressures or selective pressures, but I think there still is evolution.
Okay, and evolution towards what? This goes back to that first thing when I was asking, does evolution always make creatures stronger or better?
Well, well, to that point, if it's a stressor or something that's kind of inducing evolution, that will make me think, okay, it's to evolve for to be better equipped for survivability. So
right,
without
if you have a
stressors,
selective pressure, right?
Yeah, without that, I'm assuming it would be detrimental. The evolution. I think I'm still using words to kind of insinuate good and bad, but
Anyone else have some thoughts?
I think evolution does make like what do you call this, organisms better, in the sense that we have those organisms that are like kind of, allow me to use the example of the bunnies. So you have the short, the medium, and the long leg. The long leg will keep reproducing with better chances of survival, as well as the short leg and the mid, the ones in the mid. So they will keep multiplying, but because of that pressure being absent, it's just a mere multiplication of numbers with those that have more chances of survival and those that have less chance of surviving in case of attacks by predators. But they will still thrive. Like all of the organisms will still thrive. There will be genetic variation. Some species will be better than others, but because of the absence of the stress factor, they will still continue to thrive. It is only that stress factor that eliminates the ones that have less chances of survival.
Okay, so back to our definition of evolution, then is evolution occurring? So if you have no selective pressure, you're saying everybody's thriving, right? Because we're defining thriving as, well, nothing's killing everything off, so it doesn't matter which set of genes you have. Is evolution still occurring?
Since we defined evolution based on the genomic structure as well as the allele, allow me to call it, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but yeah, because there is that genetic change within the structure of the DNA of these organisms. So I guess evolution still occurs. I am subject to correction.
Abood, what about you? Zakiu? Any thoughts on this, Shepard?
Hello, Prof. Me, I think stress is required for evolution to take place.
You think the pressure is required for evolution to take place? Okay,
Yes.
that would seem like a logical answer. Anyone else want to chime in? This is a really important concept. This is why I'm spending time on it. Mungo, what about you? What's your thought here?
I think still evolution will be able to come.
Okay, so if evolution is okay, so how are things evolving in the absence of selective pressure?
No,
repeat the
Prof.
question again?
We've said we've got 3 steps to evolution.
Right. So we have our 3 steps to 3 principles for evolution, right? Variation, selection, and reproduction. But if we define evolution as change in the distribution of an allele in the genomes over a population over time, we can see how these 3 things will lead to changes. But in the absence of the selection, is it still possible to have evolution?
Based on the criteria, I think it is not possible, but I still have questions on it.
Yeah, you have a feeling that it is happening, but you're not seeing exactly what it is. Okay, so we've talked about the creation of mutations, how they can happen, right? You get cosmic rays or some error in the cell during DNA replication that leads to a mutation. Now, all of a sudden, you have this new mutant version of an allele in the gene pool. And if there's no selective pressure against it, well, that organism, as Shepard mentioned, will thrive, right? It can continue on to thrive and have children and have many progeny. And so that allele will continue on, right? It's a new allele that wasn't there before, but now through, mismatch repair or through some other form of mutation, you now gain this new allele. And so there you're seeing a change in the distribution of allele in the genome of the population over time. And if you took a fairly long period of time where there wasn't a selective pressure, one might imagine that many mutations could accrue in the population, right? They'd be different mutations, and by our definition of there being zero selection, none of those mutations are giving an advantage towards reproduction, right? So they're accruing, but there isn't a huge slant on, removing certain alleles out of the genome. So all you're doing is you're adding diversity. It's something that we call genetic drift. Okay. So genes, if there's no selective pressure, will over a long period of time collect different mutations. Not necessarily bad, not necessarily good, just mutations, they're differences. What defines something as good or bad doesn't get defined until you get a selective pressure, right? It doesn't matter. It's just a difference. And so you get this genetic drift. Now, is genetic drift good for a species or bad for a species?
I personally think it is good.
I think it's
I think it
good.
is good.
I think it's
it
good
is
as well.
Why is it good? Okay, it sounds good. Okay, but why is it good? Tell me why.
Allow me to use this example, Prof. So when you're looking at diseases like flu, viral diseases, they have two main components of change: genetic drift and genetic shift. I'm not sure which is which between the two, but one involves that's just like a rearrangement of the structure. Then one involves a complete change to a different thing. I think that's the shift. But now in effectivity of like getting people sick, even the drift also makes these strains of flu capable of infecting people. But now the one with the shift, that's a complete set of a whole new disease that comes in.
Okay. So again, you're mixing in selective pressure a little bit because you're talking about a disease. So I'm trying to go back to where there's no selective pressure. Okay. And this whole genetic drift where things are free to change over time. One example I like to use is, well, let's consider a case where there's no real genetic diversity. So let me see when this was. In 1845 to 1849 in Ireland, a new strain of disease started to affect potatoes. Okay, it was a new disease that came around, and Irish farmers in that area were using the same potatoes. Okay, there was a very popular, very robust potato that everybody used. It was the same potato. You almost genetic clones. Okay, that's the only potato that everybody planted. And so when that disease came by, because one potato could be affected by that disease, it was affected. And since all potatoes were the same, all the potatoes could be affected, and they were. And this created what we call the Great Potato Famine. It was a huge blight that destroyed crops over about 4 or 5 year period and caused a great deal of starvation, all because the crop really had no variation within it at all. Now, you could imagine if people had let different potatoes grow, if they weren't just selecting, oh, I like this type of tuber potato because this is the one that tastes great, and so we're all using this one. There was a selective pressure kind of all sticking to one potato. If they had let it drift, so you had different potatoes they'd get mutations. The mutations wouldn't make a darn bit of difference until the mutation does make a difference. Maybe one of those mutations, for whatever reason, inhibits the growth of that disease or doesn't allow infection, in which case you get somebody that survives. You know, another good example of this is sickle cell anemia. You're probably familiar with that. It's a fairly well-known disease. It's caused by a single mutation in the genes that encode hemoglobin, and it causes a cell shape not to be the way it should and be kind of like in a sickle cell shape. Is it bad? Well, it certainly can have health effects for people who have sickle cell anemia. And so, you know, at first glance, we would all like to say, well, that's a bad mutation. Well, it also turns out it gives you immunity to malaria. And so now, is it really bad? If it allows millions of people to survive in an area where malaria is very present, then one might think that, wow, that's a pretty good mutation. You know, it's got some side effects that aren't, you know, as positive. And so you can't define whether a mutation is good or bad until you get the selective pressure. And then that helps decide, well, if it's stopping somebody from living, it's bad for that particular person that's not going to be living anymore. But if you have no selective pressure, you allow this genetic drift, which builds diversity in the population. And the more diversity you have, the better you're going to be as a species to survive the next selective pressure. Remember, our first principle is we have to have variation, right? Without with the potato famine, you had no variation. And so since you had no variation when a selection came along, if a member of the group couldn't survive the selection, then nobody in the group could survive the selection because there was no variation. So you have variation first, then your selective pressure comes, removes certain people or certain entities, individuals, from being able to participate in reproduction and pass the genes on. And so over successive generations, the distribution of alleles change probably pretty drastically. But even if you have no selective pressure, you're still changing the distribution of those alleles over time. You're accruing mutations, you're accruing diversity. And at first glance, you know, we always want to try and ascribe a positive or a negative to any kind of mutation. Is it good? Is it bad? And I think that's a mistake. You know, we've in Nazi Germany, prior to the Holocaust, this whole concept of eugenics, of the perfect human being, came about. And there's a perfect example of how you completely misuse science and misread science when you say certain genes are quote unquote better than other genes, because you're just making these arbitrary selections of what you think is better, when actually what's better for the species is having the greatest diversity biologically possible, because you never know what the next selection is going to be. Okay. In our country, when COVID hits, there are people that are probably much more susceptible to the disease than others and could cause them to die. And so we had, just like around the rest of the world, very, very high death rates. Because of misinformation and the way our politics work, a lot of people on one side of the political divide didn't want to use masks. They didn't believe in vaccines. And so they didn't. And so if you look at the statistics now, more Republicans died than Democrats over that period of time. A selective pressure based on a behavior, which affected, some segment of a population. I always find that to be kind of interesting. I won't talk about again whether that's good or bad. So if one looks at how humans are evolving right now, I get this question a lot in class. Well, are we still evolving? The longer we go without a selective pressure, the more diversity we build up. Now, sometimes it can be seen as bad. I mean, there are probably more people today that are born with asthma, but because of modern medicine, people with asthma can survive fairly well. You know, there's a lot of things that our medicine allows us to tolerate that back in the caveman days, that person would have been ruled out and they would have never made it to reproductive age. But now, because of medicine and lifestyle, we can tolerate a lot more because we've got more food, more nutrients present. And so we get a lot more diversity. Now, it does mean more people are going to be born with more genetic diseases and pass those genetic diseases on. But is that a bad thing? We don't know how bad that is until a selective pressure comes along. And if those people are the only ones that are immune to the selective pressure, then the species survives. And so my point is diversity is really important. And so later on, when we start talking about climate change and we think about the impacts of climate change, we want to not only think about the selective pressure and how it's weeding out, you know, a certain subset of a species because it doesn't have a certain trait. We also want to think about what's left behind and what's the diversity of the pool, the gene pool that's left behind, ready for the next stress, right? So that's got to be a measure of health. Now, anybody want to make any comments or observations on that? Okay, so another thing we have to talk about a little bit is how long this process of evolution takes. Okay, remember that with, you know, we looked at this graph last time. The biggest temperature change we've had is between now and the last ice age, right? And, you know, we've seen about a 4-degree change that we're expecting in the by the year 2100, and that's about the same size change as what we've seen since the last ice age, right? But that change has happened from the last ice age, coming out of it, was over 10,000 years. That's a few hundredths of a degree per century, right? It's a very small, slow change. And we're doing a change that's really fast. 4 degrees Celsius in 1.5 centuries. Maybe 2 centuries, if you want to put it, but a very short period of time. And so the question is, how long does it take for evolution to occur? So what I'll share with you now is what I call the case of the peppered moth. Okay, so this type of moth, Beeston betullaria, is in Northern Europe. Okay, and there are different alleles for how much color production are in their wings and for their patterning. Okay, so there's a light form called typica, and the dark form would be Beeston betullaria carbonaria. And in 1811, this dark form was very, very rare. I think they had one specimen in captivity. About less than 1% of the population were these dark moths. Okay. And like I said, these lived in Northern Europe, specifically in England, and they tend to live in forests that tended to be covered by lichen, okay, on trees. That was their habitat. And so you can imagine that the light coloration was a lot more helpful than this dark coloration. And that probably explains why only about 1% or less of these moths had these dark colorations. To them, it would have been a really bad mutation, right? If you had a moth baby that was dark like that, you felt really bad for them, because which moth do you think you're going to be, a predator's going to be able to eat, right? A bird's probably going to see this. It's much harder to see this moth over here, right? So where does that get us? In the late 18th century, pretty much we're at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, factories started to arise that released a lot of pollution. Okay, they were doing primarily burning of coal, which would put a lot of soot in the atmosphere. And so many of the trees in England became really blackened with this soot. Well, as you might imagine, things changed for the moths. Okay, this used to be the case before the soot on the trees, but then the trees became blackened and darkened. Which of these moths do you think the bird is going to be able to find in this case? There's a
The
better
lighter
picture.
colored moth.
Right, the lighter colored moth, all of a sudden, new environments with a soot-covered tree, it really changes the evolutionary advantage of whether you're dark or light. It's actually more advantageous to be dark colored. In 1895, when they measured the population of these moths, 98% of the population were these black colored moths. So that's in about 80 years. Over 80 years, you went from less than 1% all the way to 98%. But that's because you had this variation that existed. It predated the selection, right? And it was a variation that would allow them to adapt. And so because of that, you have survival of the species, you have evolution of the species, right? Because you're changing the genetic distribution of light color genes versus dark color genes, but the species survives. Now, if you had chosen something different, like if your selective pressure was, we're going to change the environment from being 22 degrees Celsius, room temperature, to 500 degrees Celsius. There's no mutation that would be around that anybody has that would allow them to overcome that selective pressure. They don't have that kind of variation. And so the entire species dies. So you've got to ask yourself, does the variation exist within regards to the selective pressure that you're looking for, right? If there were no black moths at the time when this Industrial Revolution started, since within 80 years, 99% or 98% of the white moths were eaten, you can imagine that if there were no black moths during that period, there'd probably be no moths left at all after 100 years. And so you have to have that variation. Now, this is one case of what we call very rapid evolution. It's been set up nicely because there was already a mutation in existence that existed within that variation before before we applied the selective pressure. If you have a selective pressure that's being applied new and there isn't that variation that exists yet, you hope that the selective pressure is acting slow enough that there's time for, if somebody does develop a mutation that's beneficial towards that selective pressure, that they'll have the chance to reproduce. And so it's really important that, like the geological changes that things have had to adapt to, like in the case of when we were coming out of the last ice age, the changes in temperature were gradual enough and over a long enough period of time that there was enough time to generate new mutations, new variations that could then give them an advantage, as opposed to doing it really short where you don't have that much time. So I guess I'll talk about this more again later. So I really want you to think about the effects of climate change, and I want you to do some research to select an impact of climate change, okay? Do you all know how to do searches on PubMed? It's pretty easy if you haven't done it. If you just go to Google and type in PubMed, the first link you'll get is to this PubMed page. It's their search page. And this is a great place to do any kind of biotech kind of searches. And you can put in okay, and it will pull out titles. I suggest going to the advanced tab. That will help you at times set stuff up, but you should get a lot of these. Now, if we expand this, if you make sure your browser's nice and big, you'll get this little thing on the left side where you can select free full text. And so now everything that's left, all these articles, you'll be able to select and download. So this is a great research tool that's free to use, and you can find a lot of articles that will be kind of appropriate. Now, for our next peer teaching assignment, I've put the link up already. This is the assignment, is I want you to describe an effect of climate change, or one effect that's exacerbated by the effects of climate change in detail. It can be weather related, such as the effects on cyclones, typhoons, monsoons, etc. Or you can focus on a particular organism and how it affects that organism and the impacts of the food web around it. So I want you to discuss the significance of the impact. Doesn't matter whether it affects humans or other species, either one is fine, but try to be as quantitative as possible. Use slides or graphics or video. You know, if it's something that you're looking that's local to you and you want to take some local video and say, hey, look at this. This is what I'm talking about. I would like you to try and select things, impacts that are most relevant to the geographical location that you're in, or something that is of particular interest to you. And I'll go ahead and I will put that link into the chat as well, and it will be up on Moodle. Let me go ahead and put that in the chat. So that should take you to that prompt. But I want to hear what you guys are interested in talking about in terms of the effects of climate change. Now, this might be related to what you might be interested in doing as a future project, right? We talked about a capstone project, a proposal that you'll do at the end of the 2 years. This might be the very beginning of getting some research, letting me know what you're excited about, investigating. And by putting it into, one of these 5-minute videos in a peer teaching, you'll let the rest of the class know about it. So I'm really interested to see how those things turn out. Any questions? Okay, well, thanks a lot, guys. I will talk with you soon.
Thank you, Prof. See you on Friday.
Have a great day.